Hey, good day, everybody, and welcome to your live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Rouxbe, and also one of your chef instructors in the courses. And today's focus is on my office hours. So this is a chance for you to ask really any question that you might have that concerns food and cooking. And as far as the rules of the game go, I'll ask you to, keep the focus in that area rather than stray out into nutrition and medicine. We'll keep the focus on food and cooking. And then the other thing I want to mention is as we get going here, on your right-hand side of the screen, you'll already see some questions that have been populated. And you at the top of that stack in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there's a light gray text box that says add question here. And if you have a question or even a comment, please feel free to type that in, and that'll make its way to me. It'll be queued in the list of questions on the right-hand side. And you'll also notice as you look at an individual question that there is a heart icon. And you can click on that if you want that particular question to be bumped up higher in the queue. In other words, I'll get to it a little bit sooner than later, but fear not, I will get to all of your questions today. Now, if it turns out that you come up with a question or some information you want to share afterwards, you're always welcome to send those in, and you can send those into support@rouxbe.com, or if your question happens to be related to a specific task in the course that you're in, then you can use the Q&A function on the task page. So those are a couple of ways that you can reach us. And certainly if the question is directed specifically to me, you can feel free to mention my name, and it'll definitely get to me. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on into today's list of questions. So the first one from Jose Arnal. And welcome. Haven't seen you in a while since you graduated. And so the question is, graduates of the Professional Plant-Based course had received a Rouxbe Certified Plant Based seal. What's the use of this seal? Specifically, can this be displayed in public on the walls of my own restaurant or beside my dishes, which I cooked? So the seal, also called a badge, was originally intended for graduates of our programs to place on their website or maybe on their LinkedIn page, for example. But certainly, you can use that badge anywhere you want. Okay, so including, in those places that you mentioned on your wall of your restaurant, for example. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Marti. You always say that you like to make notes while cooking. How do you keep them organized for easy reference later? Yes, so ultimately I like to type them up, and so they're stored in my computer, and I can access them and modify them and share them as needed. But if I have an ongoing project, so for example, right now I'm in the midst of this experimenting with fresh masa, and so I've got a notebook that I keep in or near the kitchen. And I'll just jot down notes as I go from day to day, and sometimes it's there from week to week. And then if the notes get really copious, I'll take a break and enter those into the computer, and then ultimately collate all of that into one location. And so that's my basic approach. Most of my projects, my notes revolve around specific projects that tend to have a start and an end date. And so I'm able to, then type those up and store them. All right, thank you. And next up from Barbara. So hello, I always look forward to this class. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today. Could you please talk about the creative development of a dish rather than just following a recipe? Wow, this is an excellent question, and also a very broad and even deep question, but let me at least get started by sharing some thoughts here. I might need to contemplate a little bit as I'm going here, but let me give it a try. Um, the creative process, and I think this is probably true in a lot of different disciplines as well, but certainly for me and for cooking, it involves study, and it involves an ongoing exposure to possibilities. And so those possibilities include cooking technology, cooking ingredients, as well as methods and techniques that one might apply to those ingredients. And for me, as far as the generalized study goes, it's traveling, it's eating a lot wherever I go, and also I will periodically take a cooking class locally, maybe at the local community college or by somebody else that is offering a course on a topic that I'm interested in, one that maybe I'm familiar with, and I just want a new take on it, a different angle to understand it in a different way. Or it might be something that is new to me, and I'll enroll in a 2-hour, 3-hour, 4-hour class, for example, drill down a little bit, ask that person some questions, couple that with some reading, and then some experimentation at home to understand the ingredient, the process, the technology, the history, the cultural context. And those things feed that creative vessel that's within me. It gives me the tools and the ability to draw upon those tools as I'm cooking. Another approach to this study is to look at regional cuisines, so that at a basic level, at a historical level, at a traditional level, I understand what ingredients come together sensibly. And that's a starting point for cooking. And then from there, I'll improvise. Maybe I don't have peppermint, but I have chocolate mint in the garden, right? Or, maybe I don't have Italian basil, but I have shiso. And so, these things, these ingredients, I can swap in and out. There are some similarities. I'm familiar with them in terms of they're being related to one another botanically without getting too far down the lineage. And they share characteristics, whether it's mintiness or something else that again makes it easy to make substitutions. And substitutions are part of the creative process. Okay, and so sometimes, of course, it's necessity, right? That is the mother of invention or creativity in this case. As we run out of an ingredient, we might be forced to not just eliminate it, but to bring in a substitute and just see how that works, right? I don't have all the answers, but I am certainly happy to experiment. And if it goes well, I'll write it down, right? I like to take notes. And so that's the way that I approach developing this creative process. Of course, then in the kitchen, ultimately, it means just pushing aside all those barriers that are brought in by recipes, right? And one thing that we like to say in the educational kitchen is don't be bound by the recipe, right? The basis of the Rouxbe approach to learning to cook is to understand the methods and techniques and other handling styles, right, when it comes to food. And recipes are provided as examples, as ways to practice your understanding of these foundational knowledge points. And once you do that, then you are in control of the recipe. Okay, so give that a try, and look for similar ingredients to make substitutions, and kind of start from there. That's an easy way to to kindle the fire of creativity and have some fun with it. All right, thank you. All right, next up, what is the best approach to cut fruits or vegetables the same size with minimal waste? For example, in the zucchini cutting exercise, I wasted a lot of zucchini trying to get the cuts the same size. Is that normal, or is there a better technique? Aha. So I'm going to answer this from a couple of different perspectives. Okay, so number one, concerning our knife skills exercises. In those exercises, the goal is for you to practice to that ideal shape and size for that given cut, right? So a medium dice, for example, the textbook version is a 1/2 inch cube. And so when it comes to that particular assignment, then that is the baseline that you'll be compared against. And so if your cuts deviate from that, then I'll give you some feedback accordingly. Now, within the day-to-day cooking, okay, that degree of accuracy of your cuts may or may not have that much meaning. It's going to be up to you. And really, when we get to adding speed to our cooking process, the accuracy tends to drop. And so there's a trade-off there, even in a professional kitchen. Okay, so in really the top echelon of kitchens around the world, so these are often Michelin-starred restaurants, these are contexts where the presentation of the food is really important, at least to many of those chefs. And this is where you find knife cuts that are really precise. And you have your kitchen staff that will take the time needed to produce that quality. And that's part of the entertainment of food at that level. This is one reason why you might spend hundreds of dollars for a meal at such a restaurant. Now, in every other restaurant and in probably most all home kitchens, that's not going to be the case. And so you get to judge just how important the accuracy is. Maybe, for example, on a day-to-day basis, you're going to understand what a medium dice is, or a bâtonnet, or a brunoise, and what the results of those cuts are in terms of mouthfeel and texture and visual interest to the dish that you're producing. And you'll make your cuts pretty close, to each of those benchmarks. And then perhaps on a special occasion, when you want to present call it a nicer, elevated meal in some way, you might spend a little bit more time on those cuts. So again, that decision is going to be entirely yours. All right, great question, Joe. Though, thank you very much. And let me add, one more thing, and that is regarding the waste that's generated, through knife cut exercises. It's doubly important to find an outlet for the trim or the scraps that are generated. And this is going to be true in a professional kitchen as well as a non-professional kitchen. Okay, and so if you are cutting a dice of zucchini or a carrot, and you've got some edge pieces, little trim pieces left over, then think about a soup or a stew or a puree or a carrot bread or something else where you can capture those pieces. But definitely, we don't want to throw those away for a number of reasons. All right, thank you again. All right, next up. You mentioned soaking brown rice prior to cooking. I know this is a good idea to soak and discard the soaking water because of arsenic. I don't know how to adjust the rice to water ratio after soaking. Also, cooking time. Can you give some guidelines? Yes. Brown rices are pretty forgiving. Okay, when it comes to cooking. In other words, you can cook them with a lot of water, and for the timing doesn't necessarily have to be precise, at least while you're learning. You're going to figure out your own approach to brown rice, depending on the particular variety that you're using and the technology that you're using, for example. But let me mention that generally speaking, because brown rice is so forgiving, I like to use what's called the pasta method for cooking grains. And the pasta method, if you can just envision cooking pasta, it involves lots of water relative to the quantity of the grain. Okay, so in this case, brown rice. And you can cook the rice until it's done to your preference, and that's going to depend upon how it's being used, or again, just what your personal desire is. And then once the rice gets to that point of doneness, you can strain it and then return it to the pan with a lid and let that steam kind of draw back into the rice as it cools slightly. Okay, and that's going to ensure a more tender inner grain. All right, as it reabsorbs some of that moisture that was otherwise pushed out, or is trying to be pushed out in the form of steam. Okay, so I think this pasta method for grains is this method is important to keep in mind. It can be applied to wheat berries and farro and many other grains that you might consume in their whole form. It's just a really easy, adaptable, flexible way to handle these grains. Okay, and this of course allows you then to soak the grain, to pull out any of these impurities, arsenic being one of the more recent concerns, and then move forward without a lot of concern, okay, around the water ratio, for example. All right, thank you. All right, next one. How do you put together food pairings for a vegan dinner that's satisfying? I have to drop my mother's meat, potato, vegetable salad mantra. Okay. So, here again, I will speak a little bit to this creative process, as I just touched upon a few minutes ago, where I recommend, and I continue to do this myself, and that is to investigate regional cuisines and how flavors come together in certain ways that have been tested over time by those people in that region. And there are sets or suites of ingredients that are also characteristic of a given region. And those tend to go well together. They make sense on the palate from a flavor standpoint, a textural standpoint, aroma standpoint, for example. So, I always suggest that people study regional cuisines. And start with something that appeals to you, right? Whether it's a Mexican cuisine or Thai cuisine or Indian cuisine or Japanese cuisine or something else, and then go from there. As you move through a plant-based course, whether it's forks over knives or whether it's our longer plant-based certification course at 6 months, you can start to develop your skills around those foundational points that are introduced, and the intersection there I think is going to give you a lot of flexibility on what you might create. And then again, out of that, right, is spawned more creativity, and you can start to visualize and imagine and tinker, right, with combinations of methods and ingredients to create things that are going to be satisfying. Now, of course, what is satisfying is really specific to your experience, your expectations, as well as your particular family, and that's going to revolve around textures and the visual appearance of foods. Aromas and flavors and tastes, of course, are going to be a part of that. And don't be afraid of to branch out a little bit. A big part of flavor interest and flavor development is the aroma component, right? Or when we think about flavor, aroma makes up about 75 or 80% of that experience. And so it's a really good thing to incorporate aromatic ingredients. And aromatic ingredients include fresh herbs to finish a dish, whether it's a hot or a cold dish, for example. Or it could be spices. Spices are a favorite area of mine to dabble in. And you can bring out a lot of palate interest from those two categories of ingredients. Okay. And, once again, because there's often a little bit of intimidation as we approach those categories of ingredients, herbs and spices, because if they're unfamiliar, take a look at some references. There's the Flavor Bible, or the Vegetarian Flavor Bible, which I like to reference as a sensible place to start. There are other titles that will look at food and cuisine in a way that sort of analyzes and orders things in a way that makes sense. Okay, and so there's some study and some experimentation on your part to find a place of satisfaction for you and your family. All right, thank you. All right, next up, I see that brown and white rice have arsenic in them, but what about bulgur and quinoa? And yes, there are many grains that have naturally occurring arsenic to some level or another. And whole grains, or brown rice, whole grains with their bran layer intact, tend to hold on to more of this arsenic, from what I understand. And this is why it's often recommended to soak whole grains, brown rice, for example, to draw out some of that, and then to discard that water, and then to continue with cooking with fresh water. Okay. But yes, so other grains like quinoa are also believed to have some level of arsenic, but references that I have come across indicate lower levels than brown rice as a reference point. Okay, but you can expect that as a naturally occurring result, I guess, from the soil. All right, thank you. And next up, what kind of career options will I have? Will having the certificate give me? Wow, this is another very broad topic here, and let me share a few thoughts that come to mind. Among our graduates, some of the feedback or stories that I'm familiar with, include folks that have gone to work for an existing restaurant. Restaurant, I use that term broadly. It could be a catering company. It could be a smaller scale cafe. It could be a food truck, but a food service operation of some sort. And that gives them an outlet to practice and share their knowledge, their skills developed around food handling. Now, also keep in mind that, like probably any other schooling you go through and then subsequent job that you get, a tremendous amount of learning takes place on the job right after you finish your schooling. And so, you're going to learn the foundational points of cooking here at Rouxbe, and then you go out and you sort of refine those skills and expand that knowledge with additional experience, okay, on the job. But working for people is one thing that our graduates have done. Starting similar businesses are things that our graduates have done. And also, folks might start a blog and start writing about food, photographing food, sharing their travel experiences that focus on food. There are ways to monetize, right, these websites and these blogs. And so these are things that people are trying to do. Those are all activities that take some time, like any business, right? It takes some time to develop a following and to start to generate some money that contributes to your livelihood in some way. There are also folks that develop a food product, something that is packaged. Maybe it's a sauce or cookies or crackers or something. There are also folks that develop, meals that are delivered and ready to eat. And these would be done on a subscription basis, for example, like we see through some of the mail order companies that are popular today. So these are some ideas on how some of our graduates have worked in a professional capacity to utilize the knowledge that they have gained through Rouxbe, the skills that they have gained through Rouxbe. Okay, so think about what might appeal to you. If it is a food service establishment that you have in mind, I always suggest that you go work for somebody else for a period of time to learn the ins and outs of the business, because the food service industry is interesting. It is full of idiosyncrasies, and profit margins are slim. We work with a perishable inventory. So there are many challenges that you will be faced with. And so it's good to get some experience on somebody else's dime before you head out and blaze your own trail. Okay. And then once it does come time to start your own business, whether it's, again, a food service establishment or you're developing a product, I always suggest developing a business plan. That is, your sort of your initial path, and even an ongoing path for your business with some mile markers, so to speak, to help you check in and see how things are going. And if you're in the United States, the Small Business Administration has a program called SCORE, SCORE. You can go to score.org, and they provide free mentors, free mentoring on small business development. And so you might check out that service. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up, can you recommend a particular balsamic vinegar that is the best health-wise, but also has the best value? Expense is not over the top. How do you go about choosing a basic one for everyday cooking, since there are so many flavors? Yes, Carol, this is a challenge. And, one that I have a fair amount of experience with happens to be called Stutz brand, and you can find that online. As you mentioned, there are many, many brands out there, and it's really becomes a trial and error sort of an experience of buying a bottle here, buying a bottle there, and seeing how you like it. Testing it out in different applications. You might reduce it to see how it acts and reacts. You might try it cold. You might try it hot. You might try it on ice cream. You might try it, in different ways to see how you like that particular product. If you don't like it, give it away to somebody and let them find some enjoyment with it as you move on to the next brand. At the top echelon, right, of balsamic vinegars, you have the traditional styles that tend to be relatively expensive, and all of them very good. And then once you drop down a tier or two, you get into these more mass-produced, non-traditional styles. But even within those categories, qualities can differ quite a bit. So, you're bound to find something that suits your needs, that balance of value, right? But it will take some experimentation on your part as you share opinions and look for opinions online, perhaps. Of course, beware, because one person's perspective and affinity toward a product may not align with yours. All right. But otherwise, give it a try and take notes as you go. All right. Thank you. And next up from Maria. Miso paste and mung beans are two new additions to my kitchen. I have found myself avoiding these two items because I get lazy and don't search for a recipe that includes them. What are a few examples for each that can be added to basic dishes? Okay, let me talk broadly about handling these two ingredients, and then, as far as maybe a recipe or two to practice with, I'll let you look for those. But miso paste, I'll begin by saying that there are many types of miso. And here in North America, we might be exposed to a half a dozen or so. But there are dozens and dozens and dozens of varieties of miso if you were to visit Japan. Um, but generally speaking, if you look for light miso or white miso, they tend to be a little sweeter, a little bit lighter in body, a little bit less intense in flavor, versus the darker or red miso, which tends to be a little bit saltier, a little bit more intense in flavor. They can be mixed as well if you prefer something in between. That's okay. That's commonly done. And I will begin my suggestions by sharing the idea of soup. Miso soup is something that I make every morning for breakfast here at home. And as a base, you can adjust the quantity so that it is a subtle backdrop to the soup, or it's a more prominent flavor as you add whatever you want to it. So this morning it was cabbage and scallions. Sometimes it is chard leaves. Sometimes it's beets. Sometimes it's carrots and onions. Sometimes I mix in some other things like gochujang to get a little bit of a chili flavor. So I'm certainly not making traditional Japanese style miso soup many times, although sometimes I do. But it becomes a beautiful base for really any kind of a soup. Miso paste can also be spread over fish and then baked or broiled. And that creates a nice, salty, sort of an umami providing crust or layer on top of the fish. I recommend going easy, go thin, because the flavors tend to be quite concentrated. You can always thin it down a little bit, of course. And miso paste can also be used as a dipping sauce. You might thin it out a bit, a few drops of water. You might add a few drops of soy sauce. Maybe there's some grated ginger that you add to it, and then that can be used again as a dipping sauce. It becomes a base for a salad dressing. So those are some easy ways that you might use miso. Because miso provides salt and umami and other flavors, it can be added to any other soup or stew, or wet sort of a medium that you might be working with. I will add it sometimes to tomato sauce that goes with a pasta dish, any sort of a Western style simmered or braised dish like a stew. I'll put in a dollop of miso, and it adds a nice little layer of additional flavor and complexity. And your diners don't necessarily know what it is. You can mention it or not. It's up to you. But those are some ways to start to use miso. Okay. Now, as for mung beans are quite versatile. Here at home, we often will sprout them. And you want to soak them overnight in that case, and then you can cut the water, hang them up in some cheesecloth, and then it'll take a day or two or three. It kind of depends on how warm or cool your environment is. And then you might dunk them in some water for a few minutes once a day just to keep them moist. And then otherwise, they'll be encouraged to sprout. Once they're sprouted, you can let the sprouts grow to any length that you want. Anywhere from a quarter inch to an inch or more. And then you can cook them at that point. You can incorporate them into soups, into stir fries, or you can even use them raw in salads. That's quite fine. If you're not going to sprout them and you're working with whole mung beans, then you can cook them. They don't require soaking like other larger legumes do. They tend to be pretty easy to work with. Cooking time can be upwards of about 30 minutes. If you're using a pressure cooker, it might be 15 or 20. And mung beans also come split, and in which case the cooking time is reduced. But you can use the mung beans cooked to a point where they're al dente, and I shouldn't say, maybe, okay, let me explain that a little bit more. So, to the point where they're cooked all the way through, but firm and hold their shape. Or you can add a little bit extra water so that they become a little bit soft and maybe mushy at the edges. Again, just depends on how you want to present them. Khichdi is a traditional Indian or South Asian preparation, one where mung beans are combined with rice. Often it's basmati rice, but it could be any other rice. And that's cooked with lots of water, made into sort of a porridge consistency. And some herbs and spices and other flavorings like onion might be added. And then that's enjoyed as a breakfast or as a light meal any time of day. Mung beans are known to be easy to digest. And so therefore, they're popular for certain people for certain reasons, and or certain times of the year where easier to digest foods might be desirable. Okay, and so those are some ways to get started. Feel free to add mung beans, a fistful of them, in with anything really, mac and cheese, right? Combine it with your refried beans, your cold salad, your potato salad, anything that you might be consuming, and then just get to know it in that way. All right, thank you. All right, next up. I know it's coming up to my course. I'm coming up in my course later down the road, but prior to this, could you explain using stainless steel frying pans and avoid foods sticking to them? Eggs, meat, starchy foods. Okay. All right. So Brian, you're burning up in New York City. All right. Excellent question here. So yeah, you'll find definitely a lesson on heating the pan as well as cooking example. But basically, if you're going to be working with what we call sometimes the mercury ball test or the water ball test, where you will slowly heat that pan up while you add a very small droplet of water to the pan, and you're going to watch how it reacts. And the hotter the pan gets, the more it's going to start to sizzle and steam away. And then it's going to get to a point, or maybe I should say a heat range, where that little droplet of water is going to bounce around and skitter around on the surface, and like a ball of mercury. And that gives you an idea that the pan is pretty hot. And when it comes to especially things like meat, you can put that meat in the pan, and it's going to start to work on the fats and proteins, and after a few minutes, it'll have a tendency to release by itself, and certainly stick less than if the pan were a lot cooler. Okay, and more of that is explained in the video lessons that you'll come across. But so that's one way to start. Now, I will also mention as supplemental information to the video lessons that the mercury ball test, or this water ball test, is intended to, just as practice, as you get to understand and feel the heat of the pan for the given food that you're cooking. Okay, and so the idea is not to use the water ball test every single time you heat your pan from here on out. It's just to get you to do it a few times, and then to, literally feel the pan, the heat on your face, on your arms, on your hands. Okay, and then you can start to gauge what's going to be best for the item that you're cooking. When it comes to starchy foods, okay, like potatoes O'Brien, right, or some sort of a hash brown potato, they still require fat. Okay, starchy items tend to stick, and if you try it without oil, you'll have quite a fight getting those things off the pan. Not to mention the cleanup afterwards. So they still require some fat because the temperature of your pan is going to be relatively high. Try to keep in mind that it's going to be best to use a refined oil with a high smoke point, okay, in order to avoid the smoking of the pan. And that should be quite fine. Once you add something like a medium diced potato, let that sit for a little bit, develop the color on that one edge, and then you can move it around to get browning on the other sides. I recommend using a metal spatula with a flat edge rather than a rounded edge, one that you can really get up against the surface of the pan and scrape underneath the items, okay, like the potatoes, so that they you kind of scrape underneath that beautiful browning. Otherwise, there's often a tendency for the browning edge to stick a little bit, and you end up shaving the potato right off of that, all that beautiful flavor. And then you have to clean it up afterwards too. So keep that in mind. Eggs are a different animal, okay? Eggs are even more persnickety and stickety. And so keep a nonstick pan, okay, for a backup. I prefer a nonstick pan for eggs because they don't talk back. They don't give me any problems in a nonstick pan. If you're using something other than nonstick, the next pan of choice for me is a well-seasoned iron or cast iron pan, in which case I'm going to use a good amount of fat to avoid the sticking. Stainless steel requires a good amount of fat with eggs. Otherwise, you can run into some problems. So keep that in mind, okay? But otherwise, for cooking eggs in stainless steel, you don't want to heat up the pan a lot because you'll end up overcooking the eggs, okay? So the mercury ball or the water ball test does not apply to egg cookery, okay? So yeah, hopefully that answers your questions here. Thanks a lot, Brian. See you in the course. All right, from Laura. What are your go-to substitutes for wine in recipes? For example, replacing Madeira. I tried red wine vinegar, but it was a bit, vinegary. Cooking plant-based without alcohol. Okay. So we're looking for non-alcoholic substitutes for all the cooking wines. So, as we think about substitutes generally, this could be any ingredient, okay? Think about the function, right, or the role of that ingredient in that recipe or in that particular place in the recipe. So when it comes to Madeira or really any other wine, the function primarily is to add flavor, okay? Secondarily, we might get some acidity out of it, but primarily it's going to be flavor. And so if we think about other things that come close to the flavor, what comes to mind for me is grape juice, okay? Although it's going to be probably a lot sweeter. But there is a product called verjus, which is the juice of the underripe grape. And this is non-alcoholic. It provides some of the flavor of the grapes, some of the acidity because it was from grapes pressed underripe, so they're a little bit sour. Okay, so verjus, Verjus. And so that would be my preferred replacement for wine. But also, keep in mind you can just omit the wine, and you can use stock if you're going to be deglazing a pan, for example. That's going to provide some flavor because it's a flavorful liquid, and then you can control what other flavors go into that. Apple juice works, but it's also very sweet. So it depends on what the wine is going into, what dish you're preparing. So keep that in mind. Okay. But yeah, definitely steer clear of vinegar, because that will give you just too much sourness. That's going to be true of probably any vinegar that I can think of. And yeah, hopefully that'll get you down the road. Okay, so stock, grape juice, and verjus. Okay, those would be my go-tos. All right, thank you. And next up, from Marco, I started a whole food plant-based diet, and being a person that loves cheese, do you have any recommendations on a brand that you use that gives you the satisfaction of a replacement for a dairy cheese? Marco, this is a tough question. Cheese is the one thing that keeps a lot of people from going 100% plant-based. In my humble opinion, it is pretty difficult to replicate the real thing with the plant-based version. At least, or maybe I should say, especially for some of those hard aged cheeses. Okay, Manchego, for example, which develops just such a beautiful, rich, complex flavor and finish right on your palate. Just due to all that beautiful stuff that's going on as it ages for 6 months or 12 months or 3 years, right, depending on what the cheese is. So there's going to be some compromise that's necessary on your part in terms of the flavors that you're going to have to give up. Part of this involves shifting your thought process, okay, and not thinking about what you're missing, but embrace what you have in front of you in the way of the plant-based option, okay? There are, of course, a few different brands out there. There is one, it's a California-based company called Miyoko's. Miyoko is the brand name and the name behind the company, and their products are pretty good. Okay, and you might give those a try, but again, they're going to hit upon some places very nicely in terms of being a replacement, but maybe not satisfy you in others. And you can also start to make some of these things at home pretty easily. Okay, and there is a cheese kit that's available, and I'm not remembering the brand name right now, but I believe it's a Portland, Oregon-based company, and these kits will produce softer cheeses that will mimic some of the fresh cheeses, mozzarella, and even some that have a little bit of age, like some cheddars. Okay, and you've got some control over ingredients that you use, and you can tailor them to melting or more or less. And it's a fun way to dabble in non-dairy cheeses. Okay, so give that a try, all the while keeping in mind that the spectrum of flavor and satisfaction is really going to be limited if you're a real cheese aficionado. Okay, thank you. And from Anne, is dairy-free mozzarella shreds plant-based? So, Anne, in my experience, they are, at least the handful of brands that I'm acquainted with, but not necessarily so. I mean, you'll still need to read the ingredient label to make sure that the product meets your requirements. Okay, but many of them are plant-based. All right, thank you. All right, next up, we have a series of 3 questions. Are stocks and bone broths the same thing? What's the secret to a perfect filet mignon? What's the difference among sauteing, searing, and pan frying? Okay, let me start with question number 1. I love this question. So are stocks and bone broths the same thing? The quick answer is yes. Stock, broth, and bone broth. Okay, they're all the same thing fundamentally. Okay, And let me explain. So I, in the past, have taken a look at this question, and I've done some reading of some historical texts. I like James Beard as an author, also Larousse Gastronomique as a reference. There are others that I've looked at, and these folks will go back 150 or 200 years or so, looking at what was done, in the realm of cuisine and cookery from those origins. And these references, in a big way, are key references for contemporary cooking, at least in North America. Okay, and what these references say is that if you, again, go back 150 years or a couple hundred years, stocks, right, which we talk about today as being based upon the bones, right, of the given animal, back in the day, they tended to be made with equal parts bones and meat. Okay, and so as time went on and cooking moved from the cooking by professionals, okay, shifted from the homes of the elites to businesses, then profit became the motive. Okay, so in that setting, it became more lucrative to serve the meat as a steak, for example, rather than simmer it to make a flavorful liquid. Okay, so and this is where we start to see a more clear distinction between the use of bones and the use of meat in a kitchen. All right, and this is where we start to see the discussion around stock as resulting in coming from bones, and broth as coming from meat. But really, those lines are blurred. Okay, they're the same things. I mean, after all, in a kitchen, in any kitchen, if you're making stock and there's a little bit of meat on the bones, does it make it a broth or a stock? Well, it's the same thing. If you have a little bit of meat left over, some scraps, and you want to add that to your stock pot that otherwise contains bones, does that make it less of a stock and more of a broth? Not really. It's all the same thing. Okay. Now, the confusion really arises in the marketing of those products in this modern era. Okay, so if you go to the grocery store, you can find on the shelves products that are labeled as stock or broth or bone broth. And if you read the ingredient labels on those three categories of products, you will find that they all say the same thing. Okay, there are variations within each category. In other words, some might be based upon bones and water only. Some might be based upon bones and water with aromatics. Okay, and some might have meat and aromatics and bones in them. All right, and so there's, again, a lot of overlap. And in terms of recommended usage for any of those products, packages will recommend sometimes drinking it, right, as a tonic, or using it as a soup, right, as an ingredient, right, in something, while they refer to it as a stock or a broth or a bone broth. All right, so in summary here, then, stocks, broths, and bone broths really are all the same thing. Okay. Number two, what's the secret to a perfect filet mignon? I think the quickest answer is to cook it to your desired doneness. When we're cooking any sort of a muscle or anything else, really, right? Plant foods as well. It's to cook the food to the desired doneness. And in the case of beef, all right, I'll use the reference of medium doneness, which is about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, right, or about 60 degrees Celsius, just as a reference point. And if you want it cooked, more or less, then you just adjust the timing or the heat intensity. Okay, and so when it comes to a filet mignon, it's typical to sear, right, or to caramelize the surface in a pan on the stovetop first. And we do that by really heating up that pan, and then also using some fat, some oil. And this is where I recommend a refined oil that has a higher smoke point. You're going to bring that pan all the way up just to the edge of the smoke point before you put the meat in the pan. And then you'll flip it over after the first side gets some nice deep color, and then develop color on the other side. And it's also common to add some aromatics. Maybe it's some herbs, thyme or rosemary sprigs, with a knob of butter. So you have a combination of oil and butter. The oil helps temper the smoke point. The butter adds flavor. At this point, many people like to baste the meat, okay, with this flavorful oil that also has the flavor of the herbs drawn out into it. So once you get some nice color on the meat, then the entire pan is placed into a 400-degree oven to finish cooking. Now, how long do you place it in the oven? Well, it depends on your desired doneness. And it could be just 5 minutes or so, or it could be a little bit less or a little bit more, depending on the size of the steak as well. Okay, this is where I recommend using a thermometer, an instant read thermometer. An analog version that's it's been set for accuracy, or a digital model is quite fine. And you want to probably pull that meat out when it's maybe 4 or 5 degrees lower than your desired finish time. And then as you pull the product out, you allow for this carryover cooking, which will increase the temperature and kind of push the doneness of the product those additional 5 or so degrees. Okay, and if the pan is really hot, which it should be, you might even pull that meat out of the pan and place it on a rack over a plate, and then you can loosely tint it. Just loosely cover it with some foil to let it rest. Okay, and those are the basics, the basic approach to cooking a filet mignon or really any other good steak. Along with some practice, so that you can achieve the desired doneness, which is a very big part of your enjoyment. All right. So question number 3: what's the difference among sauteing, searing, and pan frying? So let me start first with sauteing and pan frying. Sauteing and pan frying. Well, let me start with sauteing. Sauteing is a dry heat cooking method that, by definition, is high heat, high temperature, and uses minimal fat. Okay, saute means to jump. And so, when we use the word saute, at least in some, historical, traditional sort of a way, it refers to that pan tossing technique, or that food is jumping in the pan, right, as we heat it up, as we cook it. Sometimes it's caramelized, sometimes it's not. It just depends on what you're preparing, what you want to do with it. Okay. Pan frying is a term that is used a little bit differently depending on maybe who the author of the book is, for example, the reference, who's speaking. So on one hand, pan frying is identical to sauteing. Okay, it is a dry heat method that uses a relatively small amount of fat. Here, the products such as the medallions of pork are added to the pan, but they're not tossed, right? So they're not jumping, they're not sauteing in that sense. But instead, maybe you're using tongs or chopsticks, and you're developing caramelization on one side, and then you're turning each piece over individually to develop caramelization on the other side before you reach your desired doneness and you pull the product out of the pan. Or if it's a thicker cut of meat, you might then put that pan in the oven to finish cooking, right? So there's a more, I'll say, secondary sort of techniques that you might consider that could accompany pan frying. All right, but fundamentally, it's the same as the saute. As a cooking method. Okay, now as I look at searing, I think of searing not as a cooking method, which is one of these primary categories, but I think of it as a secondary technique that could be applied to a food item, right? Where we're really caramelizing the surface of an item. Okay, and so searing is equivalent to developing color. All right, from a the contact with a very hot pan. All right, so that's how I think about those three terms. Hope that helps you as well. Thank you. All right, Sunny, we've got part 1 of 2. I love it. All right, so I'm having trouble extracting a good amount of gelatin in my white chicken stock. I get some, but not nearly as much as I see in other student photos. I'm using backs, sometimes feet, okay, never letting it boil, and low simmering for 2 to 6 hours, okay. And then part 2 of 2 with my last batch. After straining, I further reduced the stock on the stove by about half, and after refrigerating overnight, I had much more gelatin. Does this just mean my water to bone ratio is off in the initial cooking? Okay, so favorite topic of mine here, stock production. So yes, I mean, so as a basic starting point, the water to bone ratio is really important. That's going to affect the results tremendously. Okay. Now there's the time component. Okay, the longer you simmer the products, the more the collagen, which is the connective tissue in bones and meat and tendons and ligaments, the more that's going to break down, and the result is what we call gelatin in the stock. Okay, and of course, the water ratio still is going to have a major effect on that. So the tighter that ratio is, the more the gelatin is going to be concentrated, right? The more water you have, the looser it's going to be. Okay, it's a pretty easy relationship to understand. Now, simmering temperature is going to be important. So you want to have a pretty healthy simmer. And so the simmering range I think of as being 185 to 205 degrees Fahrenheit, which gives you noticeable bubbles at the surface of the pot, often at one edge, okay? But the size of the bubbles will be fairly noticeable, versus a poach, which is going to be much more gentle, 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And, you're not seeing bubbles breaking the surface. And at the other side of this spectrum is going to be boiling, which is usually much more vigorous and widespread bubbling across the surface of the liquid. All right, so simmering is going to be in between, and we need to have it really, at least in the mid-range, that 185 to 205, in order to break down the collagen that results in the gelatin. Okay, so temperature is a key component here as well. As you mentioned, Sonny, once your stock is done, if it is thinner than you want it to be, then yes, you can strain it and then reduce it as you did, okay? And you have total control then over the results, to the point where you can reduce your stock by say 75% or more. And the result is a thick, syrupy liquid that, when cooled, will set up hard and rubbery. Okay. And you can then just dice that into little pieces, and they are essentially a bouillon cube. Okay. They're perishable, so you need to freeze them and then just drop them into soup or stew or some other pot of food to add a hit of flavor. If you're going to give this a try, I will also mention that as the liquid reduces in the pan, you want to transfer it to an increasingly smaller sized pan, okay, to slow the evaporation down. The flavors can start to shift and become less than desirable if the process goes too fast. And then also the risk for burning increases. So you got to drop the intensity of the fire, and it's got to be really, really gentle, right? Otherwise, all that time and all those resources will be wasted, because it'll be unusable if the flavor shifts too radically. Okay, so keep that in mind if you want to play with some of these more intensely concentrated variations on stock. But otherwise, they're really nice to have on hand, these more concentrated, almost bouillon cube-like products, because they give a beautiful hit of flavor, and they're convenient to have on hand because they don't take up much space in your freezer. Okay, so give that a try, right, as you continue to tinker with stock production. All right, thank you. All right, next up is the company you mentioned for the cheese kit out of Oregon called Urban Cheesecraft. Yes, it is, Marco. Thank you very much. That is it. And I've tried their, I don't know, must have been half a dozen different styles of cheese from them, and they all come out very nice. They're all very fun to play with, and gives you some sense of how you can create your own recipes as well, based upon their framework. And so, yeah, give that a try. Thank you. All right, next up, why is it called steaming rice when the rice is added to the water in the pan? When steaming vegetables, the vegetables are in a basket above the water. Thank you, and I'm really enjoying the course. Thank you very much, Suzanne. So good to know that you're enjoying the Rouxbe experience. I don't know. I've asked that question myself. I guess it's just the name, steamed rice. Thanks. All right, next up. Why is stainless steel cookware recommended for the cooking course? It tends to be the easiest to care for most people. It's low maintenance, in other words, but most any cookware is fine. I'm am quite comfortable recommending cast iron or anything else that you might be comfortable with. We use clay pots here at home and all kinds of stuff. But I would say it's because stainless steel is relatively low maintenance. All right, thank you. Next up, I would like to try reheating cooked foods by steam. However, I am not interested in using aluminum foil or parchment paper to wrap and hold the foods together. What other materials can you recommend I use to reheat cooked grains? I like to use leaves. Okay, banana leaves. You can buy at the store in the freezer section, and depending on where you are, you might have access to other leaves. Tea leaves in Hawaii. Fig leaves are edible and make a nice liner in a steamer basket as well. But leaves are very nice. Give that a try. They provide a nice perfume, right? They're all a little bit different in the aroma that they impart as well. So at least be aware of that, right? And you can then sort of pick and choose as you go. All right, thank you. All right, Sherry, you have questions about developing flavors. Ask away. I'm happy to share ideas. another thought here is we have an archived live event on flavor development, and it gives a lot of ideas on different ingredient categories as well as techniques that you might employ to develop flavor, to control flavor, and to have some more fun with your cooking. Okay, so do take a look at that live event that is archived. All right, thank you. So Sarah says, love this course. Excellent, good to hear. Do you ever reuse parchment paper? Yes, all the time. I wipe the sheets with a damp paper towel, but I don't know if saving them for another use is safe. I think it's quite fine. Just dry it. I think it depends really on your comfort level more than anything. I mean, at some point, they get kind of grungy looking, from the fats that it absorbs, or maybe the food stains that are left behind, and you're going to think, hey, it's time to replace this. And that's really about as simple as it is, I think. But yeah, definitely, we reuse parchment paper here at home all the time. Thanks. All right, do we get a certificate for the 90-day plant-based course? So that's going to be the Forks Over Knives course. And yes, there's going to be a certificate of completion for that. All right. And next up, Peter. What is your opinion of the healthiest diet? Also, what's the tastiest, healthiest thing? That's a tongue twister. You have made or had. Okay. Wow, these are a couple of interesting questions here. So, the healthiest diet is really the one that's tailored to you. Okay. And, certainly one that is plant strong, right? Or even all plant based, up to you, right? Is a good idea. The approach that I like that allows you to tailor your eating to you is the Ayurvedic approach to cooking. Okay. And it very briefly, and I've got a couple of live events archived where I talk a little bit about Ayurveda and cooking within that context. But, in a nutshell, Ayurveda will take a look at, some of the psychobio-energetic qualities of you. And you get to sort of filter that by taking a survey and getting an idea of where you lie on this spectrum. And then foods are also aligned with these three categories of what are called doshas, and Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And then you can eat in a way that will balance your doshic makeup. And it takes a little bit of study, but once you learn the foundational points, characteristics of the doshas, and how to figure out your food, it's a fairly intuitive process, and I really like it. It changes seasonally. It also changes depending on what life stage you're in, because your doshic balance can also shift a little bit. Your needs can shift. Certainly it does throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the season. And so Ayurveda allows you to accommodate these natural changes that all of us experience. Okay. And so that's my go-to, okay, in terms of a dietary framework or an approach to eating. Your second part, what's the tastiest, healthiest thing you have ever made or had? Probably the tacos that we eat every week. We've been, making tortillas for a long time at home using masa harina. Right now, I'm in the middle of this process of making fresh masa. And so nixtamalizing the corn, grinding it, and then making the tortillas. And the aroma from either masa harina, right, or the fresh masa, when compared to the ready-made store-bought variety, is just tremendously different. And that aroma equals flavor, and the flavor equals enjoyment. And then from there, you're going to use any sort of a filling. Sometimes it's just one or two with an accompanying salsa. So a very simple, meal spread. Maybe I shouldn't even say spread, but just, meal offerings that are really satisfying. And I think that's probably it for me. The corn tortilla is really satisfying. So give that a try. And it looks like Patrick just uploaded links to the past archived events that I mentioned, flavor development, as well as the first of my two talks on Ayurveda. So you can click on those right on your screen and take a look at those as well. All right. So next up, I eat regularly steel-cut oatmeal. I've taken to putting it in a bowl with spices, pea milk in a 1-to-1 ratio, throw it in the refrigerator overnight, then scoop out a portion in the morning and either microwave it or stovetop cook it for 2 to 3 minutes. My question is this cooking adequate? Well, I think in terms of is it adequate or not, it's going to depend upon, your own body, really. And this goes back to, in a way, my Ayurvedic approach to eating. Depending on one's makeup, some people may be more, right, or less comfortable with eating steel-cut oats, which are, relatively large in size still, that have been cooked for a minimal amount of time. Okay, so this is, I think, a great example of a time when it becomes very important for us individually to pay attention to our bodies and how we feel after we eat. Okay, and in Ayurveda, there's a saying, and it goes something like, if you want to know why you feel the way you do right now, think about what you ate, yesterday, or maybe in your previous couple of meals. And if you want to know how you're going to feel tomorrow, then look at what you're eating right now. Okay. And again, our requirements change depending on age, depending on activity level, depending on the season of the year it is. And so it makes sense that with these environmental changes and biological changes, that our diet changes as well. But on a narrower time scale, in other words, day to day and meal to meal, I think it's desirable to really pay attention to how we're affected. Do we feel heavy and maybe bloated? Do we have excess gas? Do we feel peppy and energetic? I think we can kind of gauge how our body is accommodating the foods that we're eating. Okay. And then, of course, there are the aesthetic qualities of the food. If you enjoy eating the food that is cooked for just a couple, 3 minutes, that's one thing. If you prefer something a little bit softer on the palate, then maybe a little bit longer cooking time would be a good idea. Do keep in mind generally, however, that the more that a food item is cooked, the easier it is to digest, and the less sort of physical work that your body has to do to access any of the nutrients that are there. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind. All right, thank you. All right, and Cheryl, I am having trouble finding a weekly dietary hospital menu online. Okay, so this is for one of our assignments in the professional plant-based certification course. My recommendation, I have a couple of them. One would be to Google something like a hospital menu or hospital menu sample or example. And you'll come up with some options there. And then another approach is to take a look at a hospital that's near you. Go to their website, look for their food service subcategory, and then drill down. They probably have room service in a cafe and a restaurant and some options like that. And there's bound to be a menu that you can take a look at as well if you wanted to look at something that's maybe more local to you and therefore maybe more meaningful in a certain way. All right, thank you. Let's see. All right. So yes, Sonia. Yeah. So it looks like I didn't answer the second part to your questions. And so we talked about Madeira and Marsala, or no, I guess we did. So this is similar to a previous question. So Madeira and Marsala impart flavor. Okay. That's going to be the primary role. Madeira and Marsala are examples of what we call fortified wines. And they are still wines or table wines that have had additional alcohol added to them, usually in the form of a neutral brandy, a grape-derived neutral brandy. And that stabilizes it, or it increases the shelf life of that wine. And that wine is then allowed to be aged in different environments, different types of barrels. And so different flavors develop. And so we have Madeira and Marsala, and there are a number of other fortified wines that all have their particular characteristics of that tradition and of that region. And so it's going to be the flavor that's going to be imparted to a given dish as we deglaze or reduce it in some way. All right. And then also, note that there are different styles within each of these categories. Okay, so the world of fortified wines is quite vast. All right. And then the second part to your question, can I also add fresh ginger root to the garlic and mushrooms? Absolutely. Yeah. Feel free to, add those favorite flavorings. Please take a moment to explain that, in your description in the case of an assignment. And that's always nice to see as well. All right. Thank you. And question, how many recipes will we learn to cook in the 90-day course? Offhand, Jeffrey, I don't remember. I'd have to take a look at the website, and we offer a quick outline that you can take a look at. And you might just take a couple of minutes and look at rouxbe.com, select the course, in this case, Forks Over Knives, and you can see the profile of the course. All right, thank you. All right, Kathy says, love your talks. Thanks so much. I love to talk about food and cooking, so I'm glad you're here. I am in the FOK class and overwhelmed and loving the course. Okay, excellent. My idea of cooking is ordering at Subway, so have a long way to go. Okay, we're here for you. Love all of the wonderful information and ideas and sharing. Excellent. Take it day by day, take it task by task, take it lesson by lesson, unit by unit, and practice. Practice makes better. And practice along the way, and before you know it, right, your knowledge base will be deepened and your skill set will be bolstered. And your confidence will draw you back into the kitchen, right, to experience more of the joy of cooking. That's really what it's all about. Use recipes as a point of inspiration, maybe as a loose, guide, but never to box you in, right? Always come back to your skills and your knowledge. And certainly during this phase, as a student, as you're coming up that learning curve, if you have any questions, please send us a note, and we're happy to walk you through a particular scenario. In that case, the more information that you include, the easier it is for us to provide you the most meaningful response. Okay, so enjoy. Thank you. All right, Carol asks, is a brunoise cut the same size as mince in a recipe? No, these are two different animals. Okay, a brunoise is a particular size. It is a 1/8 inch cube. A mince is not defined by a size, so it can be an irregular cut. You can just close your eyes and whack away at the food, and you're going to produce a mince. Okay. A mince in size can vary. There's a fine mince and I guess something bigger. You get to name it, but it's going to be irregular in shape, not defined as the brunoise is. So that's the difference. Okay. Could you give me a few examples of how cracked fricassee can be used in a recipe? For fricassee, I like to use it in salads, in a grain plus something salad, as I would bulgur, which is going to be, similar, right? Same basic category in terms of being a grain. So I'll, combine this with legumes. And then also with other vegetables. Sometimes it's roasted vegetables, and sometimes they're just sautéed or cooked in by some other method, and then flavor it up in whatever direction that you like. Think about how you might bind it with a bit of a dressing. Okay, I'm a big fan of tahini as a component for a dressing or as an ingredient to bind ingredients as a dressing. And to that, I might give a generous squeeze of lemon juice. I may or may not add a drizzle of olive oil or some other oil like walnut oil or the noisette. What am I thinking of here? Filberts, hazelnuts, hazelnut oil, or even a pistachio oil for some very interesting and intense flavor. Okay, but definitely combine it with some other things for its flavor, its texture, and enjoy it. All right, thank you. And so Brian asks, is there any option for text such as a PDF of these events so I can save some time for later reference to your answers? At present, we do not have a text offering for the live events for these office hours. Might I suggest taking notes, right? One of my favorite things to recommend. And thank you for your interest, though. And then last up from Carol, when dry sauteing onions in a stainless steel pan, I always keep the heat on high until I deglaze the pan. Then I turn the heat down to medium or simmer, depending on what I am making. Is that correct? Or should I keep it on high while I add ingredients? I think what you're doing is correct. Now, I will also say that you get to control the heat of the pan, and your basic clue is going to be, is the food burning or not, right? If you're getting too much color or little flecks of burning, then it's time to lower the heat, okay? And so there might be some things that you're cooking where you decide to keep it on high all the way through because they're relatively large and color is a little bit slower to impart. Maybe the sugar content is a little bit lower, so there's less chance of burning quickly. So you can keep it high. But other times, there are things like garlic, right, which has a very gentle and a delicate flavor profile that can burn and impart really acrid flavors pretty quickly, in which case you need to drop that heat accordingly and proceed with your cooking. Okay. And so this is a great example, right, of how our experience with a particular food item, right, will dictate how we handle it, because our steps to proceed can be different, right, at each meal period. All right, so thanks so much for that question. And thanks so much to all of you for your questions today and your comments, and also for joining us in the live event. You know, whether you asked a question or not, whether you were with us from the beginning or whether you joined my office hours midstream, I'm very happy that you're here today and hope that you're walking away with a little more understanding of food and cooking. And until we meet next time, enjoy your kitchen time. Have a great day. Bye-bye.